Hello everyone, let's talk a little bit about defensive dice in Too Many Bones. This right here is a defensive dice, and your defensive stat is the number of defensive dice you have available to roll each turn. So this is the defensive stat for Boomer at 2, it's the starting stat. This is how many I can roll, and of course it comes out of dexterity on my turn. Each defense die that I choose to roll is going to cost me 1 dex in battle. So when my turn comes around and I have 3 dexterity to spend, again remembering I can always use dexterity to move orthogonally around the battle map, or all of it to move orthogonally around the battle map. I can also use this dexterity to spend it on defense dice or attack dice, and again this all must be chosen before dice are rolled and resolved. So in this case, hypothetically, let's say that I didn't want to move on the battle mat whatsoever. Actually, I'm changing my mind. I'm going to. So let's say I use 1 dex to move on the battle mat into a closer position. And then I decided instead of attacking, I'm actually just going to go into a defensive position and roll 2 defensive dice. So I would roll the 2 dice. So I've already used 1 dex for movement. This would be 2 defensive dice that I'm using currently, and that uses up my full 3 dexterity. I roll the dice and I end up getting a bones and as well as a defensive 1. So when this gets rolled, defensive, or I should say bones, go into your backup plan. As soon as they go into your backup plan, you can almost assume that these are no longer defensive dice because they will never ever count against how many defensive dice you can roll. The reason I mention that is because when you roll this type of a symbol with a number inside of it, it goes into your active slot and is essentially like you putting on armor to prevent damage going to Boomer's HP. But when a defensive die sits in this active area, it actually does count against the number of defense dice you can roll in subsequent turns. So essentially, in another turn down the road here, if we were to come back, and this is the current layout of our mat, and hypothetically, we were never attacked, let's say, by the Griffin, so we never used this defense in order to block it, because that would always occur before you take HP off. If we still had this and we were ready to take our turn again in the next round, we would have 3 dexterity. We are allowed to roll 2 defense, but actually it would be -1 because we have an active die still stuck in the active spots. So we'd only be allowed to roll 1 defensive dice. Again, the backup plan one does not matter. It doesn't matter whether there's attack or defense dice in here, or any dice really. Whatever is in there in terms of bones is only there for bones. So essentially, if it was my turn right now, I could do something like roll 1 defensive dice along with potentially maybe 2 attack dice, because now I've come close enough to the enemy that I think it makes sense to try to attack this enemy, and I go ahead and do that. And in this situation, we won't talk about the attack dice, but in this case, I rolled another defensive 1, and so when that happens, again, I could place this up into the active slot, and going forward on a subsequent round, I would actually not be able to use any defensive dice in my roll if these 2 individual dice are still there come around to my next turn. So it's very important to remember that. It's also very important to remember that defensive dice in the backup plan do not count against you. Now let's talk about defensive training, because it's a little bit different than attacking, but not by much. Let's say hypothetically that you had finished an encounter, so you have a training point that you were awarded, and you decided to spend it on increasing your defense stat. Well, if you wanted to increase your defense stat, it is not an automatic success like dexterity or health. As we talked about in prior videos, this particular one is similar to attack, where you have to roll in order to train it. So I'm going to use a training point in defense. I would roll starting with my starting stat of 2, so I'd have to roll 2 defensive dice. I don't have anything in here for my stat dice, so that's just going to still be 2. So I'm just rolling these and hoping not to see any bones. And I didn't get it. So in this particular case, I actually did successfully increase my defensive stat, which is great. So this means I'm going to be a little bit more useful in terms of defense. Now let's say hypothetically another round goes by, or another encounter goes by, I gain another training point somehow, and I decide again that I want to spend it on defense. Well, if I want to spend it on defense again, I now have to roll 3 defensive dice and hope to not see any bones. In this case, oops, I actually had a bone even though you couldn't see it, but essentially I had 2 defensive dice and a bone, meaning that I failed the attempt to train defense. Now, the interesting thing about defense training versus attack is when attack, if I roll a bone in an attack like this, it was an automatic fail, but in defense, the first time you see a bone, you actually have 1 more attempt to reroll in order to avoid getting that bone. So any bones rolled are rolled once more. and then if no bones are rolled after the second roll, you are successful. So essentially I would take the bone that I rolled and I'd re-roll it, hoping not to see another bone, and I didn't get another bone. So now at this point I was successful. This ticks up to now a total of 4. Now you'll notice that these numbers start getting really enlarged, and this is outside of the defensive talk, but notice that again, remember when you're upticking your attack and defense, you always want to keep an eye on your dexterity, because this becomes the bank in which you can use the dice that you're actually upgrading through training points.